Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. I have a very simple bio. No one owes more to his research community than I do, and this is actually the real title of this talk. Someone once asked me for a single word to put on my tombstone, and I picked omni hyper curious. What that means is a little bit complicated, but if you take a look at what my apartment looked like, this is a recreation when I was an undergrad at the University of Colorado, you'll get an idea of the problem. And if you sort out this, I just tried to do a lot of different things. So I had a math major, and math means, in New York terms, infinities, shiminities. Doesn't matter. You can just do whatever you want in it as long as it's consistent in some way. I also majored in molecular biology, and biology means finities, but they are zillionities because no matter how much you zoom in, you still have trillions and trillions of processes interacting with each other. And I worked my way through school as a programmer at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and computing means finities, but really only millionities, even today. But the catch is that you have to be nature. So in biology, nature has put together these complicated organizations of things, but when you're on a computer, you get to play nature and you have to figure out the complicated organizations. And my minors were anthropology and English, and these tied together with a deep interest in theater. And theater is many, many kinds of things, but it's in the large, it's kind of many, many people of different kinds working together to create what the theater calls a magic mirror. It is something that beams the audience's intelligence back out at them. So it encompasses so much of what makes us human. I spent quite a bit of time there. I was supposed to be working on my majors and minors, but in fact, I spent a lot of it in the theater. And by the time I got done with all of this in 1966, I was exhausted. And I was rescued by accidentally winding up in Salt Lake City at Merrill Engineering Building here and meeting this wonderful guy, Dave Evans, who on his desk had a pile of these brown covered reports from Lincoln Laboratory written by Ivan Sutherland about a new way to use computers. And he said, take this and read it, come back and talk to me about it tomorrow. And so when I read it, I found out about, in the early 60s, the experimental computer for the SAGE project, which was called the TX2, was enormous. It was the size of the building. It sort of was the building. And we learned to think about this as the time when there was only one personal computer. And that was when Ivan Sutherland got to use it from 3 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the morning because Wes Clark liked him. And here's what he did. This oscilloscope could only plot points, so he first had to write software to actually make it into a display. He had to invent rubber band lining. And then he did something wonderful. He allowed you to just sketch something and then tell the system what you wanted it to be. In this case, he said all of those lines had to be mutually perpendicular. You just saw the first clipping window ever done. And here he wants to make a hole in this flange. So he points to those and says, I want them to be parallel and connected to the top guy. And he's using them here as guidelines to make these dashes. So the constraint here is collinearity. And then he makes the guidelines transparent, and lo and behold, we have dashed lines. So he's made a hole in the flange. Now he wants to make a rivet to put in that hole. So he got some more ink and just sketches out the idea of a rivet. He's going to use this cross point here as the center for the arc for the top of the rivet. And again, he's going to tell the program to make these lines mutually perpendicular, and you are seeing Sketchpad solving that problem in real time. So he gets a nice symmetrical rivet. This is all done in 1962 with one guy in 1 year on this huge computer. Here's another solution to that problem. Now, he could have constrained the ratios of the lines to each other. But here, what he's doing is just saying, okay, just solve this problem, and what's close to it will give me a nice rivet. And of course, you want more than one rivet. So what he's actually working on here is what was called a master drawing. In today's terminology, we would call it a class of a rivet. And here's an instance of a rivet. You can see he can continuously change the scaling and rotation. Those are done by knobs on the console. And here he's making more instances of that rivet. And he realized, oh, wait a minute, I don't want that crossbar, so I'll make them transparent on the master drawing, and that means all the instances will also reflect that. So we think of that as part of what we call object-oriented programming today. So this was an object-oriented system, and I think the first real one ever done. And anything you make in a master drawing, you can make instances of. So here he's making instances of the flange with the rivet in it. And he can capture that as a master. And so he can get instances of those and scale and rotate them as he wishes. And in fact, all of the alphanumeric information he could display was also done this way by just drawing them into the system. So here's a close-up of the console, and you see Ivan sitting at it with a light pen in his hand, and on the screen we see something that looks like a truss bridge. And unfortunately there isn't a movie available of this, so we did a recreation of kind of how this truss bridge worked in Sketchpad. So here's the console. We zoom in, and as before, we can construct the truss bridge by just, now we've turned on gravity, which is trying to make the masses go to the bottom of the screen, and you see the stresses and strains on these beams here being expressed, and you see them change as we put weights on them. This made me think of what we were doing at NCAR with trying to simulate the weather, that what we really wanted was something that was interactive, real-time model of the universe that we're interested in that would allow us to try out different situations. So I think of this as the real birth of computer-aided design, but not just CAD, but also SIM. And it brought home to me something that I sort of understood, but not as well as I should have. It means that when you simulate one computer on another, you don't have to simulate the kind of computer that is generally around. What Sketchpad was was a design of an entirely new kind of computer, not just interactive and not just graphical, but in fact, with this object-oriented structure that was completely general, that had many sophisticated techniques internally to allow it to work, including one of the very first garbage collectors with an inverted pointer collection. And this thing that the ability to make a drawing and put constraints on it also allowed the drawing to act out what the constraints were because of the way the constraint solvers work. Sketchpad actually had 3 constraint solvers all working together, and it knew nothing about bridges before we did the bridge, but in fact a beam on a bridge is a kind of a spring. It's a thing that's trying to maintain its length, and Ivan did a very clever thing. He decided not to try and exactly solve constraints because this is an engineering project, but what he wanted to do was to try and minimize the total error over the actual design. And this allowed approximate solutions to be done, and a bridge is actually an approximate solution to the constraints that are put on it. And the differences between what you wanted, which is constant length on the beam, and what you get, which is beams stretching and being compressed, actually tells you what the physical forces on the beam are going to be like. And then Sketchpad had perhaps not certainly one of the first graphical user interfaces, but what was interesting about it is that instead of telling Sketchpad how to do things, you told Sketchpad what you wanted. You programmed it in terms of requirements in the common sense world of the user, and Sketchpad did the work to try and turn those common sense requirements into something that all worked together. So this system shocked me completely. I asked Ivan, how could you have done this by yourself in 1 year? And he said, well, I didn't know it was hard. Of course, we know Ivan has done this a few times since then. But in my limited experience, I'd never seen anything like this in spite of the fact that I've been programming for 5 years. And my first thought was, well, shouldn't all interactive computing be like this? You just need a computer that's a lot smaller than a building. And once you've seen Sketchpad, I started seeing other things like Simula. I saw interactive time-sharing system. I saw Project Genie at Berkeley, where David Evans had come from. The ARPANET was a proposal at that time. And once you've seen Sketchpad, everything looks like it's just a system of objects. You get this unification, which is completely impractical in any reasonable engineering terms, but fortunately, because of my degree in mathematics, I didn't care. It was so beautiful that I just went with it as math, and the engineering was still left to be worked out. And I had shown up in the middle of the fall term, and Dave said to me, there are about 7 weeks until the new term. What would you like to do with your time? And I said, well, if it was up to me, I'd go to the library and I'd read everything about computing from the last 15 years, because I don't know anything. I just know how to program. And I would Xerox every article that I wanted to study further. And he said, okay, go ahead. Gave me a unlimited Xerox account. And I wound up reading thousands of articles and Xeroxed off about 200 of them for further study. These are some of them. And this, of course, threw me into this hyper-omni curiosity problem. And some of it was clarified by a visit by Doug Engelbart, who was talking about a unified way of thinking about augmenting human intellect. And Dave had a friend, Ed Cheadle, wonderful guy, who was an engineer at a local aerospace company, and Dave got me a consulting job with Ed, and Ed had on his mind a little machine. So the first thing he said to me when we got together, he said, "Hey, let's make a little machine." And I wanted it to be like Sketchpad, but that was too much for those days. So we revisited many parts of it, and here's what that machine looked like as a self-portrait on its own display. And I hope Dwayne Call is around because I think that Dwayne actually helped by making this particular picture on the using the Flex Machine display package. Then there's an incredible idiosyncratic guy by the name of Bob Barton, who David had convinced to be a professor against his will for a year or two at Utah. And he was cantankerous. He was extremely at ease with the English language, quite a character. And in taking his first class in advanced system design, he gave us a sheet of paper. He said, "Well, there's a few things known about it. I expect you to read all of these and understand them." But then he said, "It is my job to firmly disabuse you of any fond notions you might have brought into this classroom." And he conducted this class by taking anything that we believed in regarding computing and showing why it was BS or didn't scale or had some other bad properties. And this included things he actually believed in also. So this is a really great experience. I hope you all get a chance to go through it, is to have somebody really good. This guy was a genius. Garbage collect your mind. That's what he did. And those of us who survived that class were set free to think about just anything we wanted to. But this guy did not like to talk to students. And so I wanted to talk to him, and some of my friends said, "Well, you know, he likes to read, you like to read." For instance, he likes Marshall McLuhan. And I said, "Oh, no, I tried reading Marshall McLuhan a few years ago, and I couldn't understand it." And so I decided to spend the summer of '67 understanding media, which I finally did. And that led to this confusion that I thought I'd left behind at the University of Colorado, because once you get into this stuff, the intermediaries between us and the rest of the world, including symbolic ones, you're talking about a lot of different relationships. So that opened up the world again, made it larger than computing. And the next year, in 1968, there was a conference for grad students at the University of Illinois, and one of the things we saw there was a prototype for one of the first flat screen displays, which were being worked on by a number of companies. But the reality of it stuck in our minds. So one of the questions was, what would it take to put a flex machine like Cheadle and I had been working on the back of one of these displays? But I didn't think of it further until meeting Seymour Papert a few months later. And Papert was trying to do what Engelbart was doing for children. And that left such an impression on me that on the plane back to Utah from this meeting, I started thinking about, well, children have to have computing. This is not like a car, which is the way ARPA had been thinking about it, but this is more like a book, which you want to start people on what the real deal is early. And so children have to have something that they can carry around with them because we don't want to tie them down to desks. And so I drew this cartoon on the plane going back. And so these are just three ideas that came from being in the midst of this larger research community. And of course, much, much more was going on. What I was doing was the least of what was going on at Utah, because John Warnock had been doing practical versions of 3D graphics. Sutherland and Sproul had been writing about generalized window clippings. There was heavy work being done on the head-mounted display. And so I thought of this environment that we're in as being kind of a bountiful field of grain, just giving rise to one thing after another. And the simple way of expressing what was going on back then is that the goodness of the results is most strongly correlated with the goodness of the funders. There are smart people around every generation, but there aren't smart funders around every generation. For instance, we don't have them now. Back then, the funders were wonderful and the results were really interesting. And of course, these ideas traveled. So when I went to Xerox PARC a few years later, these three things that I've been working on came along with me. But of course, Bob Flegel was already there with his ideas about bicubic splines from Utah. And also from Utah was Jim Curry, already there working on BCPL as one of the implementation languages that was going to be used there. And a whole bunch of people showed up. Some of Engelbart's people showed up, Butler Lamson and Chuck Thacker showed up from Berkeley. And everybody had a set of ideas that they wanted to work on. So this is a very rich concentration. And in fact, we got to do the Flex machine the way we wanted and much better because of Thacker and Lamson participating, being leaders in the design and the GUI user interface that allowed children to also program in this system, just as we'd hoped for this portable machine for them. And in fact, all of this particular software was done as the Internet Network Virtual Computers that I thought was a good idea. We did the engineering on it. The WYSIWYG desktop media was done. Dick Schaup and Alvy Ray Smith and Bob Flegel worked on a system called SuperPaint, which was probably the first color painting system done. The Ethernet was invented to hook everything together, including laser printer done by Gary Starkweather, the idea of client server and peer-peer, and half the internet was done here, and a whole host of other things. So this was a very, very rich concentration of what the ARPA environment was all about. And again, the goodness of the results here is most strongly correlated with the goodness of the funders. Secret sauce. Well, I think it was how well the ARPA PARC community intercooperated with each other. There are very few rivalries. And this was partly set up by the way Bob Taylor organized both ARPA when he was there and especially Xerox PARC when he set it up. And of course, because we're still talking about these 50 years later, these have proved to be very powerful inventions. Most of them are still around in very recognizable forms, which is a little bit dismaying, actually, but kind of interesting. But the power also brings a big yikes, because something more has to be done when you give human beings very powerful tools. And Vi Hart had a nice line about this. She said, "We must ensure human wisdom exceeds human power." And that just hasn't happened. So if we look at power over time, human genetics roughly constant, in many ways we're much more tool builders than we are thinkers. And anthropology has shown that we are actually set up by nature in a very, very limited ways. We like visible things, we like small things, we like quick things, we like things that are near us, we like things that are now, we like a few things, we like social things, we like stories, and we prefer to cope rather than make progress. So all of these things have led to this problem of human inventions climbing in power like mad, and human wisdom, if anything, just increasing a little bit. So this is an enormous problem because wisdom requires a lot more context than tool making. So some of this context we can express by just thinking about 6 things here. We can think about, for instance, worldview of a society. What the worldview of a society is constitutes a lot of the context about what kind of wisdom the society has. And there's this notion of richness, stuff that is not the same as making a livelihood, but participating in family, participating in the arts, and so forth. And we have duties to the next generation, and we have many cultures and schooling and so forth. But I think we can all agree that our society is very, very strongly aimed at the top priority being livelihood, and particularly our educational institutions are set up much more like vocational schools than for places to get educated and enlightened. And these 6 things are in the context of many more things. And these are in the context of a whole planet now. And if we toss in this problem of a huge gap between the power of our tools and the lack of human wisdom to match up to it, we actually are turning the planet into a cinder. I think most of the people in this audience are quite aware of this right now, but most people still aren't. Carl Sagan said we treat the earth as though we have somewhere else to go after we ruin it. Well, we don't. And so this is what some of these marvelous inventions that have been done over the years have actually led to, because the wisdom part has been lacking. And children are looking at a fairly bleak future right at this point. Now it happens that way back, October 1962, this guy Douglas Engelbart wrote a proposal for what became famous as the Engelbart system, the online system, and the mother of all demos. But the proposal was much, much more than what people thought it was. People thought it was kind of like the computing of today. But in fact, he was thinking about vastly different things. So they were worrying about what happens to people when you give them tools. So you give a human a powerful agency, and you might add on AI and computer-aided design and internet and simulation and so forth, just the whole bunch of it, and ask what is the human learning from using tools. And the problem is we humans are incredibly pragmatic, and we aren't very philosophical. And so what we get from our tools is much more how to use them than what their implications are. This is what McLuhan was talking about in larger terms. And the result, for example, if the tool is a hammer, we become hammerers but we don't become wise hammerers. And so Engelbart, in this 1962 proposal, said, look, this isn't going to work unless education and training is inserted in between every tool that we have, and especially the new ones that we're about to invent. We have to make sure that the brain that gets formed by humans using these tools is not the simplistic pragmatics of using a hammer on everything, including things that shouldn't be hammered on. We have to do something that allows these increased methods and our new ways of representing ideas to be much safer and a force for good rather than also being used as weapons of various kinds. And he said, look, in most things that human beings do are done in terms of groups. And so we not only have to augment individual humans, we have to augment human groups. And using the same model here, we see a group here of 5 augmented humans in a environment of augmentation. And we can think of augmentation as really an awareness idea, becoming much more aware about what is going on and thinking ahead of what the consequences are. And what's interesting about computing, to me, was what was interesting right from the beginning when I first saw Sketchpad, and that is Sketchpad isn't just about expressing your intentions. It allowed you to see what some of the consequences of your intentions were because it could simulate them. And so what you want is this idea of cooperation instead of competition. And you need to have at least these 3 things well set up in order to be somebody who should be allowed. This is like becoming a doctor. What do you need to know and be certified in order to be a physician these days? These are 3 of them that you need in order to be a computer scientist these days. And so if we look at the fundamental fact about predicting the future, it's actually between human ears, and it better not just be involving our brain without the rest of this context, or we're in deep trouble. We have to give the children something much richer in order to grow up in. So the result of where we are today is we can improve most things or we can destroy all of them. And if wisdom means partly more awareness and larger situations and consequences, then this is one of the great destinies for computing, just as Engelbart said in more than 60 years ago. Computing is partly about helping us be much more aware of our situation and what the consequences of our actions. And to go back to Weihart, this means we must ensure human wisdom exceeds human power. And in fact, we can do that if we choose to. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today.